Hello everybody, welcome to WhatCulture Gaming. I'm Scott, joined by Josh.
Hello, Scott.
Josh, my friend, this is a big old report as to the viability of violence in future PlayStation games by way, it's written up by DualShock. It originally came from GameSpark Japan, an interview with CyberConnect 2's president and CEO, Hiroshi Matsuyama, didn't want to get his name wrong,
Nice.
talking about how in the last sort of few years, Sony have been saying to different developers, hey, you can't have certain scenes in games. And the example that he gave was in the latest Naruto Ultimate series. Apparently they weren't allowed to show the character Minato Namikaze losing their arm because they didn't want any individuals with a human appearance being decapitated or being dismembered. However, CyberConnect 2 also made Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, which recreates the scene where Nappa, the big muscly dude, loses his arm, which obviously Matsuyama says like that's kind of like a weird contradiction. But yeah, apparently it all centers on this whole human appearance thing. But the whole idea of sort of Sony stepping in and just saying like, hey, we don't want this scene here, we do want this thing over here. We were saying before recording that it's very reminiscent of like the Devil May Cry 5 censorship in Western territories where they tried to censor a butt crack because they thought that was a little bit too risque, but the butt crack was allowed to roam free in Japan. That thing's fine. And also Last of Us 2, that game's execution animations were sort of toned down in like European territories as well. So it's weird because it kind of feels like Sony are, obviously they've made a bunch of different strides across last year, especially to try and be this more pronounced global brand. Like they made it so that X is the enter button in every territory, which Japanese, the response to that in Japanese territories was they hated it. But I think they're trying to sort of curate this global platform, which almost means catering to almost like a stereotypical exact version of what that particular region would want. Like the assumption being that, hey, we should tone down the sex stuff for the Americans and we should tone down the violent stuff for the Europeans, and it just seems a bit weird.
It is a bit weird. I just want to kind of clarify though. It was actually The Last of Us 1 that got the censorship in terms of the executions in the multiplayer, which was weird in and of itself. Like that was a few years ago. I think it's indicative of how Sony has kind of like developed and changed as a company, has taken these games on a kind of case by case basis. Because in that example, it was the fact that in Europe, the dismemberment and the kind of horrific kind of mutilation of characters in the single player, like that was fine. But as soon as those same animations were put in a multiplayer context, that's when issues arose. And because, at least according to the report I was reading, there were rumors that it was specifically due to the German censor board, which has been quite restrictive in the past. But because Sony, at least back then, rated their games by region and not by individual companies, it just meant that all of Europe got the same version, which was the censored version, which got a lot of people being like, well, why? Like, why do you do this way? Why is everyone got this censored version now in European countries and not just the one censor board that had a problem with it? And yeah, you are right. I wonder whether it is just kind of like this weird flattening, this globalization of the brand where they're trying to just kind of like generalize and go into like, I don't know, just like you said, like the DMC5 butt thing. Like I don't want to be here arguing that we need more butts in video games. But even like the way they went about it was kind of weird because it was just like the scene was still in there, but they just threw up a lens flare, like you said. So it didn't even like lose much really. It's not like the content or the context of the scene was changed, because I know they have been making a lot of strides in how they want to, portray female characters in games, which I think ultimately is a good thing. You know, they want to be wary about potential sexism in games, and they want to kind of move away from any depictions of, underage sexualization and stuff like that. But throwing up like a lens flare is not like solving that particular problem. It's just kind of putting if anything, it's just like putting a band-aid over it. It's kind of like, well, what's the point then? What's the point in just throwing this kind of like half-assed version of it up,
That was the whole thing with DMC5. Like, I adore that game, and I reviewed it. I think I gave it 4.5 stars. I knocked off half a star because throughout that game's story, like its general portrayal of women doesn't come across very strongly at all. They're sort of just half-naked set props like thrown to the side, which is a whole other conversation. But because that's obviously a bigger fix than something that would be like in the realms of like censorship. But like that's kind of the question: is because basically a lot of this also one thing to mention is that the changes that Sony sort of mentioned, it also goes in line line with Japan's computer entertainment ratings organization, CERO, which I guess like is kind of their version of like the ESRB or the BBFC or one of those ratings boards that says like, look, this game isn't going to go to retail unless you make these changes, and they're the CERO, the board that enforce those things. And so like the DualShockers report says like, well, we don't know if this is going to be the case where, you know, different games are going to be censored outside of Japan as well. But obviously that's why I brought in the Devil May Cry 5 thing, because you are getting what is ostensibly the same game code with very minor edits based on region. And whether or not that annoys you, like, you know, as an individual, like for me, it's just like, well, do whatever, like make whatever the game is that you, like, just because, like, make whatever you want, and then it's like, yeah, if you need to censor it for the sake of, you know, taste, like, I understand that there's obviously going to be some things that are just ridiculous. The go-to thing is the swath of balloon-boobed samurai games just all over Eastern territories. It's fine for them to exist in the West, but I think that stuff tends to be held up as, like, you know, like really annoyed fanboys going, well, we want our oversized balloon women, and it's like, that can be allowed to exist. I understand that. But it's like that whole idea of like, why can't we just get what the creator wants to put out? Like that was always something that Yoko Taro was talking about with like Nier Automata as well and things like that.
And I think, you know, you make a good point in that DualShockers article and in I think it was a Reset Era thread as well. You know, they were talking about how the Japanese censor board kind of, Sony went above and beyond what they had to change to get that approved for the age rating they wanted, you know what I mean? So it wasn't just like these individual censor boards are coming, like as they have always done, and being like, look, can you make an edit here? Can you change this? Can you remove this drug reference? Can you do this and that? It's the fact that like Sony's taken that on board and then made extra edits on top of it. I think that's what's gotten people kind of talking and a little bit worried, because it's like, well, what are their standards? And I think if they just came out and made it clear, like, this is what we stand for, this is what we want, because ultimately, like, it's their platform, it's the games that they want to curate in their platform. Ultimately, they have final say. We've got other places to play these titles, on the Switch, on the Xbox, PC, or whatever. But at the same time, it's like they're not entirely laying it out what the guidelines are, what the rules are, quote unquote, and the fact that it is changing on a game by game basis, and seemingly whoever looks at it, that's when it kind of becomes weird, because it's a double-edged sword, right? You know, again, going back to like the DMZ thing. On the one hand, advocating for this butt to be shown is not a hill I want to die on, but then at the same time, it's such a minor and strange thing that it's almost like, why is Sony also trying to like dying on this hill as well? You know what I mean? It's kind of like it's a strange,
but like as is the case with like
scenario, man.
Yeah, it's like, as is the case with anything though, like obviously like it makes it this weird, stupid thing to talk about in regards to saying, well, I want the butt crack in the game, but it's obviously not that. It's the principle of it. It's the principality of censoring something like that for a Western audience, implicating that like, oh, a Western audience can't handle this, or they would be somehow be corrupted if, God forbid, they saw an arse crack in the middle of Devil May Cry. And I think I can get that. I mean, it's like, you know, you look back at all sorts of different censorship in media history, in film history, TV history, and gaming history, and 9 times out of 10, like it just results in creator's vision getting put out there eventually, like whether it's a director's cut of something or whatever, and just, you know, the fault is always going to lie with the individual, with various other sort of influences, whether it be like parents or just like the upbringing, whatever it is. It's not going to be the entertainment product that corrupts the youth, which tends to be the thing that, you know, always gets held up as like, oh my God, won't somebody think of the children? There's a bum in Devil May Cry. Like, I just tend to think that, you know, it needs to, whatever someone wants to make needs to be able to get out there within some realms of decency.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think for me, the most interesting part of this whole thing isn't necessarily just the censorship itself. It's how it feeds into how, like you were saying at the start, how Sony's kind of restructured itself over the past decade. You know, in general, like there was a big thing, a big push towards, like I said, like this almost unification of the brand across different cultures, across different countries. Like there was they mentioned that their, you know, marketing strategies in the West or in Europe or whatever were going to be more or less the same, which kind of like lost that regional flair, which we've talked about before. Like we've talked about the history of UK-specific PlayStation marketing and advertisements, for instance, and I feel like we kind of like lost that. I don't know, like the subtle differences that make PlayStation as a brand kind of feel a bit more personal and feel a bit more, I don't know, feel a bit like something that's more tied to your own identity and old culture or whatever. And when you get like these kind of sweeping things, like you said, where it's like this thing is allowed here, you know, we're allowed to show the intensely gory mutilations and glass going into the eyes of characters in The Last of Us Part 2. But if you have this game in Japan that shows someone, you know, without an arm or getting their arm removed, that's suddenly something that, you know, Sony is like, no, that's too much. And it's like, where do these kind of like contradictions fictions end, and how much do they influence each other? I have no answers for this topic, by the way. I want to make this specifically clear. I just find it fascinating that as the years have gone on, Sony just like kind of continues to do it, and even though there has been potentially some pushback, they haven't really clarified, their intentions really at all.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's tale as old as time in regards to, like I said, media censorship, and it's not like video games are any stranger to this thing either. Their approach seems to be splitting versions based on region now. Like you said, there was that example of The Last of Us where, like, the Germans rating board affected all of the European distribution of that game, the version of the game that we got, as opposed to DMC5. It's a different version in America versus the one that's out in Japan. And it's also worth, like, sort of throwing in here, we did this in another video, but, like, the PlayStation 5 is not selling very well in Japan. Like, the general reaction to Sony becoming more globalized and less, like, Japan-centric, or, like I said, things like changing the enter button from circle to X and things like that. The general perception of Sony PlayStation in Japan right now is pretty sour, and the prediction, if it continues for the next few years, is that it'll sell less than half of what the PS4 has sold. So there's a whole other wider factor into how Sony are being perceived in Japan as well, before the likes of censorship and different versions of games come into it. So yeah, let us know what you think down in the comments below. Do you get all riled up about censorship stuff, or do you not care that much, I guess, depending on whatever they decide to do. For now, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com.
I've been Josh from WhatCulture.com.
And we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.